Welcome all to our very first Developing Conversations professional development. This will be a series of conversations that the Graduate Student Caucus will be offering on a variety of topics. So if you have some suggestions, feel free to reach out to our board members or put them in the chat, and we'll definitely be interested in hearing what you all are interested in. But as we're sort of in summer mode, and I hope we're really appreciating and enjoying that summer mode and just taking some time to rest. But as we're in summer mode, sort of transitioning back into the fall in a few months, a few weeks, we wanted to have a conversation around what comic studies looks like post graduation, to sort of begin to envision that for ourselves and to think about that in community, and also really to envision what the future of the field of comic studies might be, and might be both within and alongside and outside of academia. So Zach and I, or sorry, Josh and I have prepared some sort of micro presentations to just introduce ourselves and our own paths and what we've been up to post grad. And then we're looking forward to hearing from you and hearing your questions and just opening it up really into a dialogue and conversation. So it'll be a little informal. Uh, Josh, do you want to go first or should I?
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Josh Kopin. I received a PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas in Austin in August 2020. You will find that that date is incredibly important to what happens next. I lived in Austin from 2013 to 2020, almost exactly 7 years, nearly exactly 7 years. As it turned out, I left in July, and I moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where my partner is a librarian, an archivist at Swarthmore College. I have to get used to using the word wife, where my wife is a librarian at Swarthmore College. And I moved before I finished, and then I finished, and I didn't have a job. And so I by way of, I will tell you the order in which I got my jobs, but I just want to be very clear that when I fill out institution forms, I list as many of the following as possible, okay? Thomas Jefferson University, Delaware College of Art and Design, University of Pennsylvania, my cousin's accounting office, Iffy Books, okay? So I graduated in August 2020. Before I graduated, I got two jobs. I got a job tutoring SAT students through an online company, through a tutoring company called C2. And then I got a tutoring job through some CARES Act funding for the Bard College Early High School in Pennsylvania, in Baltimore. And then I got a job as an adjunct at Thomas Jefferson University teaching a class they call Topics in American Studies. Now, the way that Jeff works is that it's a very interesting institution. It's formerly something called Philadelphia University. The Thomas Jefferson University is a medical school, and the medical school bought Philadelphia University in like 2016 or 2017, something like that. And so it's a 4-year college that has sort of a liberal arts model, but is mostly for people interested in medicine, design, and engineering careers. The closest thing they have to a liberal arts major is something called law and society. It's basically a pre-law major. So I teach in their gen ed core. Okay, so I did that. I did the tutoring thing at Baltimore until the money ran out in October 2020. I worked at C2 for almost a whole year. I stopped doing that in the summer of 2021. I'm still at Jeff. In the summer of 2021, I also applied for this job at the Delaware College of Art and Design, another fascinating institution. That's a 2-year Associates of Fine Arts degree. The idea behind that school is that you go to that school for 2 years, you get a relatively cheap 2-year art school education, and then you go to a slightly more expensive school for the last 2 years. So it's a program designed for accessibility for art school. It's a fascinating institution. And then I taught one class there, and then this past fall, this past spring, I applied for this job at the University of Pennsylvania, teaching in something called Veterans Upward Bound. You may be familiar with Upward Bound, which is a program for high school students. And this is the exact same model with the exact same infrastructure applied to veterans. And so I've been doing that since March. I finished my first term teaching for them actually today. In addition to that, I do some busy work for my cousin who's an accountant, and I work for 8 hours a week at my friend's bookstore. Now, being an adjunct is a lot. That's a lot of things that I do and have done in the past 2 years. I have a series of structural advantages and a series of structural disadvantages that have played a role here. The first thing is that because my partner works at Swarthmore, I'm pretty much limited to Philadelphia. For a while, I was thinking about commuting to and from somewhere else, and I have still applied for positions commutable, either daily or weekly. As my wife and I have to live together for longer and longer, that has become increasingly less appealing. So that's one structural disadvantage. Another structural disadvantage was that I graduated in August 2020. And every search that I applied to in the spring of 2020 was canceled or put on pause. And so I lost a whole cycle of applications that way. Now, I have a partner who has a good job, like a really good job. And so that has floated me as I've tried to do a whole bunch of other stuff. It's made it possible for me to do all this stuff without having to worry too much about like making rent. Not everyone has that advantage, and I am extremely aware of how lucky I am in that regard. So I want to be very clear that what I have for you is no pathway and no solution, and no obvious way for anyone to get to do anything that they want to do. I have one piece of advice that I want to share before I hand it over to Maite, and I have one argument that I want to make. Okay. The first piece of advice that I have is, as you stare down the job market, it is important to recognize that while, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, right? That while some people will get tenure track jobs, most of us will not. That is a structural fact. It's a structural fact. It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with a whole bunch of other things that feel like they're about you, but they're not often about you. That can be really difficult. I've come really close twice, including a job that I honestly thought I had in the bag. So don't ever think that. It's not going to work out. The thing about applying for those jobs, though, was they were super interested in comics. We are taught is the wrong word here because it's informal. We are led to believe that comics is a disadvantage. It's an advantage. People are interested in pedagogy with comics. They're interested in comics as a form. They're interested in integrating comics into their classes. Having a person who does comics in the tenure track, on a non-tenure track, as a postdoc, it is an advantage. Do you bring something to that department that they don't already have in comic studies? Has been a topic in every interview I've ever done, both the successful ones and the unsuccessful ones. That's the first thing. That's the first thing. Sorry. So then here's my piece of advice. As a person who's been doing this for 2 years and is going to continue to do it for the foreseeable future, pick one thing that you care about. Pick one thing that you can't live without. I would not still be doing this if I could imagine myself doing anything other than teaching right now. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. But I like teaching a lot. I like teaching more than I like scholarship. And I am willing to endure this to find a place and a way to teach. And if I have to do this for the rest of my career, it's entirely possible that I will. It's also entirely possible that Emily and I will decide that we want to have a baby or buy a house or something, and that it won't be tenable anymore. But for now, this is what I want to do. And just teaching weird classes to other weirdos. It's all I've ever wanted. It's why I got the PhD. I didn't get a PhD to be a professor, whatever that means. I got a PhD to teach weird classes to other weirdos. That's my one thing. Pick one thing that you can't do without, and then make your choices based on that one thing, and be flexible in what that means. 6 months ago, I would not have told you that teaching 4 veterans how to write college level essays would have been the most satisfying thing I've done in months. But yeah, that's really, things show up in weird places and in weird ways, and not everything is going to work out, but some things are. And it's important to remember that. So that's the advice. That's the advice, is that people are interested in comic studies, don't hide it, and that you should pick one thing that you really, really care about and try to find a way to do that thing. Here is the argument. The future of comic studies is contingent. The future of comic studies is contingent. The future of comic studies is not on the tenure track. Okay, what is going to happen, and again, this is a structural fact. What is going to happen is that the people who founded this generation of comic studies, and I won't name them, you know who they are, they're going to age out. 15 or 20 years from now, they're going to age out, and there will not be tenure track people to replace them, or there won't be enough tenure track people to replace them, which means if that the field is going to continue to exist, it is going to be contingent. We don't have the luxury of film studies. We don't have the luxury of literature. There aren't departments that are going to be created, no matter what Charles wants. There aren't going to be departments that are going to be created. It's not going to happen. The structural benefits of the Cold War that film studies had in the 50s and the 60s, we don't have them. Our field has, I'm going to call it a field, not a subfield. Our field has come of age in a moment of austerity. And that is the thing that we have to realize and understand. And so what that means is if this is going to keep happening, if this field is going to keep going, it's on us. And we're going to have to keep it going despite the fact that we're working 2 or 3 jobs. Okay, despite the fact that some of us aren't going to have academic jobs, or if we are, they're going to be weird ones. They're going to be not on the tenure track, not in the faculty, in the teaching faculty. That's great, because it means that we don't have to be beholden to the structures that have made life whatever this is now. But it also means that we have to persist. Okay, that's whatever is going to come next. It's going to be contingent. It's going to be adjuncts and graduate students and people who have decided that they want to do UX design for Facebook. And that sort of sucks, but it's also kind of cool. It means that we're flexible in a way that other fields will not be. Other fields will simply die out. We are already doing this. Comic studies is contingent, and it will continue to be contingent. And the answer for us is building structures ourselves that we can find sustainable. It's not only in publishing in journals, it's publishing in blogs. It's making YouTube videos. It is finding ways to keep doing what we love, even though we may not have the support of an academic department. And that is what it is. Maite?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna go in geek teacher mode and share some slides, just because I wanted to show some pictures, but you can tell I got a little lazy at the end. And I can also, I think I copied and pasted this. Give me just a moment. I can share this in the chat in case it's easier for folks to follow on their own screen. Okay, cool. Are you all seeing these slides? Okay. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, So I sort of hopefully called this comic studies careers and futures, but it's also intentionally a plural pathways and a sort of plural futures. So I like to think of it as um, what Jose Esteban Munoz would call an educated hope. But I'm Maite Urcaregui. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm sort of in a in between space. So I just graduated about 2 weeks ago from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I was in a department of English, but I was also in emphases programs in the feminist studies department and the Black studies department. So I'm really jealous of Josh. I think my dissertation and the work I was trying to do was really more situated within American studies, but I've been housed in an English department throughout my all of my degrees, and I think that this actually worked out in my favor. Um, and then in the fall, I'll be joining the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Jose State University, which is part of the CSU system. So, a public California state school. And that was really where I was hoping to end up. I wanted to keep me and my partner in California, ideally. And I also wanted to work at a public school, but a public school that looked different than the UC system that I was a part of and was also a part of pushing back against because just before pandemic hit, grad students across the UCs were on strike for a cost of living adjustment. So while this is sort of one version of a pathway, it's by no means an idyllic one. Okay, so a little bit about my grad school journey. So I'm a first gen student, and so I didn't even know what grad school was really. I was in my undergrad, I was studying English and secondary ed. So I knew very early on that I loved teaching. I completed my ed degree and my student teaching experience, but along the way, I sort of fell so in love with my English courses and with some of the feminist and like queer studies courses I was taking that I felt that I might not be able to teach. And we see the way that queer and anti-racist histories are actively being erased from K through 12 curriculum. And so I was just experiencing this tension where I loved teaching, but I also began to be really interested in developing I don't know, being a part of scholarly conversations. And so I took a year off to teach middle school. I cried a lot and decided to go back and get my master's. So I did a 2 year terminal master's, and I really appreciated that. At the time, I was convinced even then that I wanted a PhD, and I had even applied to PhD programs, but I didn't get into any of them. And truly, I think I wasn't ready. And so the 2 year master's was great. I did have to maneuver to figure out how to get it funded, but ultimately did. A lot of terminal master's programs are not funded. But it really introduced me to some of the politics and the institutional dynamics that Josh was talking about that I was not aware of when I decided that I loved reading books and also loved teaching. And so I am always really appreciative of my 2 year master's, even though, it added sort of time to my terminal degree in the end. And then that's me just a few weeks ago celebrating the PhD. So a little bit about what I did like how comic studies factored into my graduate studies. And I saw that Elizabeth and Zach, both in the chat, were talking about that experience of being the only comic scholar in your department. That was largely my experience as well. So I was in English departments where maybe there was one or two faculty members teaching comics, but I also came into those programs pretty new to the field and pretty new to comics. So I didn't pick up a comic outside of like the Sunday funnies until I was 19 years old in an undergraduate course. And so I wasn't necessarily that fangirl that we might envision or maybe developed the field. Um, And so that was actually great. It allowed me to build community and create a space to study comics in new ways. So I actually worked with other graduate students, often in English, sometimes in film and media studies, sometimes in the Spanish and Portuguese department, who were also interested in comics. And we created really informal reading groups where we sort of would give ourselves a name and apply for funding and just get together and read books. Sometimes we'd workshop conference papers, apply to conferences together. We'd go to Denver Comic Con. So those spaces are spaces that I created not alone, but with other grad students, but really were the primary space where I was talking about comics in community. And then I also worked as a RA in other research centers. So my field is multi-ethnic US literature. So really, when I did my qualifying exams, it was American literature after Reconstruction to the present moment, and then critical race theory and theories of gender and sexuality. So that's broadly like what my scholarly profile is. And I often introduce myself as a scholar of multi-ethnic US literature, a sort of umbrella category that I recognize has tensions and is not monolithic. But I was building experience in those other fields through more established RA-ships in my program that were often thinking about hemispheric studies or critical race studies or American studies more broadly. Then I applied for a collaborative grant on campus. Again, we're just a bunch of students who came together, so we had no money to like even buy snacks, but we applied for a grant and were able to put on a symposium. And Brian was actually a part of this. And so it was a really great space to then build out some comics community outside of UCSB. Um, and then I also was publishing across venues to build a profile that was comics focused. Most of my publications are about comics, but thinking about comics through feminist studies, through queer theory, through critical race histories, looking at visual text that might not actually be part of the comics canon, but might have something to learn from comic studies and vice versa. And that includes a lot of book reviews where I was getting a free book to write a review. And like all of this is unpaid, as we know. A lot of public facing blogs. Women Write About Comics, which I know Adrian has been a part of, was a space where I got a lot of early publications and was really exciting to have a link that I could share where people could immediately read my work versus the really long and draining process and often anonymous and really mystifying process of so-called um, anonymous academic peer review. But I also, did a handful of those to showcase that as well. And then finally, I published a peer review article in Latinx studies. So my dissertation looks at Latinx, Black, and Indigenous literatures together. It's sort of a comparative ethnic studies approach to questions of visuality and citizenship in multi-ethnic literature. And that publication and a co-edited collection I began to work on with the brilliant scholar and ally Dr. Fernanda Diaz-Besteris, I think really made a difference. And all of that happened probably, it was in year 5 and during pandemic. So there were definitely a few things looking back that I had no idea would help me. I just often felt dragged along the way or like just very confused figuring out whether or not I should say no or yes. And oftentimes it was things that I was doing because I needed money. Because in my program, graduate students are funded through their 5th year. I went into my 6th year. But the cost of living in Santa Barbara, as in a lot of coastal cities in California, as in a lot of places grad students are living, meant that like my grad student salary wasn't really enough to live on. So I was working at a writing center at the community college, and that experience working with community college students, getting out of the R1 and out of the UC was something that came up in a lot of my interviews, and the way that I was able to teach writing, even though I didn't necessarily have a lot of writing courses on my syllabus. So there was that. These other RA-ships were funded. So sometimes it was things I was really just doing for money that ended up building a larger portfolio that was always invested in comic studies, but also not strictly beholden to it. Okay, and then I won't, I'm not going to share the abstract or the whole spiel of the dissertation, but as I said before, it's a comparative ethnic studies approach to questions of visuality and citizenship in multi-ethnic and often multimedia US literature. And so the intro opens up with this really wild comic from 1957. I'm forgetting the publisher, but essentially published education, aka propaganda, nationalist comics, and then moves into Invisible Man, Citizen, Bad Indians, and some Latinx editorial cartoons and comics. Okay, and so then I promise I'm wrapping up soon. But my experience on the academic job market, I would say one of the things that helped me the most was getting experience in writing grants. And I often didn't get those grants. Like I maybe got one or two small ones. I was applying to things like the Ford and the ACLS, and then some like campus fellowships. It was very frustrating. I almost never got them. I also applied to the Swan Fellowship, and Josh helped mentor me and helped give me feedback on my application. So I'm so appreciative of like peers and fellow comics scholars who helped with that. I didn't get that either. So it didn't pay off like monetarily often, but for 3 years I was just practicing working in this really condensed, distilled genre of like the research statement or the cover letter. And I think that helped when I was then applying for jobs. Last summer, I guess 2 years ago, so in 2020, I applied to only a handful of postdoc positions because I thought maybe those might be a little easier. They're not. The postdoctoral positions are flooded. I know almost no one who gets them, and I didn't. But again, it was all just practice writing in those genres: the cover letter, the teaching statement, the research statement, the DEI statement. And then this year, because my funding was out, I was able to get 6th-year funding, but it was quite precarious and has been precarious since some of the austerity measures that the university took in response to COVID-19, which is really wild in the state of California because we know that the state of California is working with a surplus budget, but that has not yet trickled down to affect the lives of grad students and undergraduate students and staff in the UC system. And so I was quite stressed about money. So this year I decided to just do a full year on the job market. I knew that I wanted to try to land an academic job, but I was also open to other things. So you'll hear about sort of my backup plan and what was going on behind the scenes. So I applied for 2 national dissertation fellowships because I wanted to try to secure money if I had to stay for a 7th year. And I was committed to staying for definitely a 7th and maybe even an 8th year because at this point, I've been providing them teaching at a rate that works out great for the university. And so they were going to at least give me health insurance for as long as they could. So I don't think that's tenable for everyone. Maybe if you have a family, maybe if you're in a program that is hostile or you're in a geographic space that you don't want to be in, that might not be tenable. But I was committed to staying on if I needed, purely just for that small salary and health insurance. But I was also a little stressed about the lack of funding, so I was applying to dissertation fellowships. I also applied to 8 postdoctoral fellowships and ultimately 28 tenure track jobs for about 6 months through September of last year through January of this year. And I streamlined it by only applying to tenure track jobs at this stage. because I was ready to just stay on for another year and then expand the search. And I also had a few geographic concerns, but I applied pretty widely. I do have a partner who is a nurse and he's able and willing to move. So that made me a little bit more free. And then out of those applications, I received 8 first interviews, 3 campus visits, and only 1 offer. And I know this is like not a success story. This is like one example of how it could go. I have lots of friends who have been had different experiences. And I think part of this is also coming onto the job market, not post pandemic, because we're still in pandemic, but post some of the hiring freezes that Josh was talking about. And also going onto a job market in the field of multi-ethnic US literature in a time where departments are really seeing and trying, sometimes superficially, but to begin to think about how to teach students about race and social justice. And so I landed a job at San Jose State University in Latinx literature and literatures of the Americas. Literatures of the Americas, again, was not a category I necessarily identified myself with, but it was surprising that some of the jobs I was a bit unsure about. I applied to jobs in American literature and Latinx literature, and sometimes in African American literature, as well as jobs in women and gender studies. And so it was sometimes surprising, what jobs I felt were maybe not great fits, but turned out to be the best fits. And I think a lot of that had to do with comic studies. They all were interested in comic studies, even though that often was not on the job. What is it called? The call. But that's what I wanted to talk about. So the comic studies definitely kind of gave me that X factor where I could teach American lit, but was also offering something a little bit more exciting. Okay, and then I also had a backup plan, so I was willing to take a 7th or even an 8th year to try to find funding to go back on the academic job market, but also to use the university to gain experience in other fields or positions. And I had planned to apply and hopefully participate in the public humanities internships. And program at UCSB. And I had colleagues who had done that, who had then landed internships at museums, at libraries, sometimes at nonprofits, and oftentimes in educational roles that weren't necessarily within the university. I have a friend from Boulder from my master's who decided that she loved teaching but hated the university. And so she landed her dream job at the Museum of Country Music, where she's heading up an educational program there and is living her best life in Nashville. So I was ready to like try to use the university and its resources to get health insurance, but also gain some more experience. And then this is the last slide, but things that I learned was that applying to jobs, and I think this is true of all jobs, it's also true of those miserable grant applications, but it got easier and less time consuming as I went. So a lot of my success was coming from jobs that I had applied to later on, because I think some of my early applications were still, a bit, I was just practicing still. And I also sort of appreciated applying widely because I got interviews at some places where I really had to think like, do I want to be here? And I wasn't sure, but I did the interview and then it gave me practice for positions that I knew I actually wanted that came later. So there was a pretty like high learning curve, but it got easier. Um, I also recommend finding multiple communities of support. So I worked with the mentorship program. I had a faculty mentor that I was paired with through the GSC, and we will be hosting those in a few months, creating those mentorship partnerships. That was helping me read my applications. I also had some other faculty outside of my committee because my committee was largely absent. Um, Providing support, and then friends and peers who were also on the market who had applied, or just my partner who had to listen to me practice or proofread my cover letter. And then I also want to emphasize what Josh did, and that is that, and I know this might sound performative as I am in a privileged position to have a tenure track job. But I also wasn't sure if that would work out. And so I think we have to become comfortable with recognizing that our worth and our identities and our happiness are not wrapped up in the job title, even though grad school has trained us to think that it is, and often to think that it's wrapped in a very specific job title, so the tenure track, but often at a specific university. So I had faculty actually telling me that maybe I shouldn't go to SJSU and hold out for an R1, but I knew that wasn't what I wanted. So at some point I had to push back against that. And then things like happiness, like geography or where me and my partner were willing to move, did make a difference and factor into some of this. And then I guess a final piece of advice, and I'll stop sharing so I can see everyone's faces. I agree with Josh. I think that comic studies is contingent, and I think that finding multiple fields and or communities and or venues that can support our work, and as Josh said, like that single thing that you want to do is important, because it not only helps us build a wider portfolio for the academic job market or any job market, but there are many ways that comic studies, like many and most fields in the university, is a toxic space that is actively hostile to many people. And so I think finding ways to navigate that space, I stay on the comic studies listserv so that I can get those CFPs, because I will not be like, I don't want to automatically exclude myself for publishing opportunities, but I do recognize that that means hearing bullshit most of the time. So I think finding ways to navigate what has become sort of canonized as comic studies, but also having our feet in other venues, whether that's Women Write About Comics or that is, tutoring. I loved tutoring at the community college. I wouldn't give it up, even though it doesn't pay that well. So something that you won't give up, and multiple things where our vision of comic studies and our experience of being a comics fan and scholar is not beholden to the field. Because as Josh said, the field's not going to get you a job. I saw maybe two jobs that were interested in comic studies, even after the fact, that piqued their interest quite a bit.